suggested retail price, they have it on everything. That doesn't mean you charge that, but what's that? Yeah, what they do at cars are famous for this. The government sets a price the most you can charge for a car, okay? So you can't charge over that. But a lot of car companies say, we're $3,000 below the manufacturer's suggested retail price, come buy from us. You can go low, but there's a cap on how low you can go without having a monopoly. That's what this law did. Does that kind of make sense to you now? Okay. All right, the second piece of legislation that was passed during the Harrison presidency was the Dependent Pension Bill. Dependent Pension Bill. And that had to do with Civil War veterans. Okay, this is just a few years after the Civil War. What happens when people come back from war? If they're good and healthy and they come back from war and they don't have any issues physically or mentally, you could probably get a job. But if you come back from war with a physical disability or a mental disability, it would be difficult for you to have a job. Back in these days, a lot of these Civil War veterans, when they were injured in war, what happened to them?
They died.
Well, if they didn't die, though, what happened if you got your leg shot in the ankle in the Civil War? They cut your leg off. What happens if you got shot in the arm? They cut your arm off. Well, a lot of these Civil War veterans came back and they couldn't get jobs because they couldn't perform manual labor because they were missing an arm or a leg or whatever. So what the law did is it gave pensions or money to those Civil War veterans that could not come back and perform manual labor and have a job. Both your legs are amputated, it's pretty difficult to find a job. That person could apply for and receive pensions or money to survive because they could not perform manual labor. Does that make sense? I mean, that's evolved into much more now when a veteran comes back. We have all kinds of aid for veterans that can't work. Yeah.
Is that for both sides?
It really was for both sides. That's a very good question. Yeah, any Civil War veterans, that's a very good question, on both sides, could qualify for pensions if they could not perform manual labor. Okay? All right. Continuing the profile, President Harrison runs for re-election in 1892, and we'll tell you about this a little bit later. But who defeats him? Grover Cleveland. So you got a battle of the presidents, and he loses, which we'll talk about later. Now, that was a tough loss for Harrison because he lost his wife, who died just 2 weeks before Election Day. So he kind of suffered a double loss there. So his wife died 2 weeks before Election Day, and then he lost the election as well. Well, after the presidency, he went to Indianapolis, Indiana. And what did he do there? Think about what his known profession was before he went into politics. What's that?
Lawyer.
No, he went to become a lawyer. Okay, so he went to become a lawyer. So after his presidency, he returns to Indianapolis, Indiana, and begins to practice law, continues his career as a lawyer. In 1896, he remarries Mary Lord Dimmick. And this was a lady he knew well because this lady took care of his wife during her illness that she eventually died from. So in 1896, he remarried Mary Lord Dimmick. And this was a lady who had cared for his wife during her illness. Did I ever tell you a story about my friend from Laurel, Montana, The Bachelor? Did I tell you that? I think I did. Maybe not. Well, anyway, this friend of mine was a bachelor his whole life. And he was close to mine. I mean, he was in his 50s. His best friend had cancer. And they were buddies for life. Of course, he knew the best friend's wife forever. And on his dying deathbed, so to speak, my friend's friend made him promise that when he died that he would take care of his wife. And he said, I would like you to marry my wife. You've known her for years. And he said, I don't want her to be alone. I wish you'd do that. So he died, and it was probably a little awkward. They started kind of dating, or at least spending time together. They eventually got married. I'm not sure they got married totally for love, but I just thought that was kind of a neat thing that, you know, he knew the guy's wife for 40 years, you know, and they got along well. He wanted her taken care of, and so he promised him. So this lady took care of Harrison's wife during the time she was ill. And they eventually, Benjamin and Mary had one daughter together. Okay, they had one daughter together. Well, in 1897, Benjamin Harrison wrote this book, which is a first edition, first printing, entitled This Country of Ours. It's a book about the federal government. So in 1897, Harrison wrote a book about the federal government entitled This Country of Ours. Benjamin Harrison eventually died on March 13th of 1901 at his home. He was 68 years old and was eventually buried in Indianapolis. So Benjamin Harrison eventually died on March 13th of 1901. He died at his home. He was 68 years old and was buried in Indianapolis. Now, to give you some local flavor to Harrison's presidency, both the states of Idaho and Wyoming came into the Union during Harrison's presidency. So, a little bit of local history, yeah?
Have we ever had a president from Wyoming?
No, Dick Cheney was the closest. He was the vice president under George W. Bush, and he was from Wyoming. Yeah, there's a movie out right now called Cheney. It's kind of, or Vice. I think it's called Vice. About him. I don't know. I haven't watched it to see how true it is, but we met his daughter, Liz Cheney, who's the member of the House of Representatives, and when we were in D.C. But yeah, Dick Cheney was the closest. He was vice president. Yeah. All right, so the states of Idaho and Wyoming came into the Union during Harrison's term. Okay? All right, moving on, we'll talk about this election of 1892. And then we're going to get into some trouble in Cuba. What's that? No, not yet. We're going to be supporting Cuba in this deal, which is really ironic how it turns out. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
And you'll see that. Okay, the election of 1892. There were three political parties involved in this election. Of course, we had the Republican Party and we had the Democratic Party. But we also had a new party that got involved called the Populist Party. Populist Party. Populist Party. And they nominated James B. Weaver as their candidate. Because we know the other candidates, right? The Republican Party nominates President Harrison for re-election, and the Democratic Party nominates former President Grover Cleveland. So there are three political parties in this election. The Republican Party nominates President Harrison for re-election. The Democratic Party nominates former President Grover Cleveland. And this new Populist Party nominates James B. Weaver. The Populist Party, by the way, was formed exclusively by farmers. All the members of the Populist Party were farmers. Now, historians will tell you that James Weaver was a little bit of an influence in this. He didn't get a lot of votes, but any votes he got probably came from the Republican Party, which hurt who? Harrison. So as a result of some of that, not exclusively, Grover Cleveland wins 277 electoral votes. Harrison receives 145. And for the first time in American history, you have a former president being elected president of the United States. And with his 277 to 145 victory in the electoral count, Grover Cleveland becomes the 24th president of the United States and the first former president to be elected non-consecutive. Okay? Now, what's Grover Cleveland hoping, Connor, as far as congressional elections go? What's Grover Cleveland hoping when they had this election?
You can turn the House and Senate back.
Right, and he did. The House and Senate went back to the Democrats, so that was a good thing for Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland becomes the 24th President of the United States, and the good thing for him is the Democrats also won back control of Congress. Now, let's talk about Weaver. He actually got 22 electoral votes and over 1 million popular votes, which without doubt hurt President Harrison. If he's not in the election, who knows? I mean, you could add the 22 to what Harrison got and say, oh, that wouldn't have made any difference. I don't think you can exactly say that. And if there's two people running, things could be much different. But the Populist Party did make a remarkable showing. Weaver did gather 22 electoral votes. Usually a third-party candidate doesn't do that. And over 1 million popular votes. Okay? All right. For sake of time, we're going to move to the next presidential election, which would be 1896. My God, we're almost going to make it to 1900 here pretty quick. Starting back at what, 1750?
What do we finish the year at?
We're going to finish just before World War II, unless I get lucky and we can get into World War II. I'd like to, but I try to get you to World War II, and we pick up that next year. All right, now, President Cleveland could have run for a third term, but he declined. And so the Democrats nominated a congressman from Nebraska by the name of William Jennings Bryan for the presidency. So in the election of 1896, President Cleveland declined an opportunity to run for a third term. So as a result, the Democrats nominated Nebraska congressman, in other words, he was a member of the House of Representatives, by the name of William Jennings Bryan. Now, at the time of his nomination, kiddos, he was only 36 years old. You know what the minimum age to run for president is? Anybody know?
35.
35, yeah. So if elected, he would be the youngest man ever elected president of the United States, which is a distinction that John Kennedy has, who was elected at 43. So obviously he doesn't win here, but he's only 36 years old. Now the man that he picks as his running mate will be Arthur Sewell of Maine. So for the Democrats, you're going to have William Jennings Bryan, a 36-year-old Nebraska congressman for president, and his running mate in the Democratic Party for the vice presidency is going to be Arthur Sewell of Maine. The Republican Party chooses another Ohioan by the name of William McKinley. And he has good political experience. He had served both in the House of Representatives from Ohio, and he also served as governor of Ohio. Ohio is kind of a big political state, if you haven't noticed. So if you've served in Ohio, you are up on the political scene. And McKinley was a good politician. As I mentioned, he served in both the House of Representatives and as governor of Ohio. And he picked as his running mate for vice president Garrett Hobart of New Jersey. Garrett Hobart. So you have a Democratic ticket of William Jennings Bryan and Arthur Sewell. You have a Republican Party of William McKinley and Garrett Hobart. Now Hobart had never been elected to any office of any kind in his life prior to be running for the vice presidency. He had like zero political experience at all. Well, the Populist Party also participated. Guess who they nominated for president?
Tom Watson.
William Jennings Bryan. So he was nominated by both the Democratic Party and the Populist Party. You see why their influence in the last election allowed the Democratic guy to win? Because they were Democratic farmers, is what they were. Okay? Now, they nominate Bryan for president, but they choose Tom Watson of Georgia to run with him. So you've got three parties now. William Jennings Bryan and Arthur Sewell for the Democrats, William McKinley and Garrett Hobart for the Republicans, and William Jennings Bryan and Tom Watson for the Populist Party. Yep.
So if none of them get enough to win the presidency, but William Jennings Bryan gets the two most, does that mean the next election when it goes to the House, is that just deciding who's the vice president is basically?
No, if nobody gets the 2/3. See, that's an interesting question because he's gonna get so many from the Democrats and so many from the Populists, right?
They all three.
You still gotta get electoral votes, so if he got the 2/3, he'd be president, but if he didn't, he would go to the House and they would decide between Bryan and McKinley. But that's a good question, but electoral votes are electoral votes, so. Well, when the smoke cleared on this election, again, pretty close, William McKinley wins, despite the influence of the Populist Party. He has 271 electoral votes compared to Bryan's 176. The Populist Party didn't gain anything in this particular election, so to speak, and so it just disappeared after this Populist Party. But it was kind of interesting because it tells you that the country is pretty what at this time. If you've got basically two Democratic candidates running, they're pretty Republican. So, you know, the country had kind of evolved in that 4 years to Republican. So when the smoke clears, McKinley collects 271 electoral votes compared to Bryan's 176, and William McKinley becomes the nation's 25th president of the United States. This fellow right here. And he's going to be our next what? Assassination victim, which we'll talk about. Well, they started getting a little more clean shaven to a point. All right, let's do our last subtopic. We'll get a quick start on this and we'll get going. Trouble in Cuba. Trouble in Cuba. Now this is interesting because isn't your perception of our relationship with Cuba right now poor at best? Yeah, it really is, right? It really is. But this is interesting. So, back at this time, in 1896 in that area, who controls both Cuba and Puerto Rico? Which country owns them? Spain. Very good. So the two countries of Cuba and Puerto Rico were kind of the last remnants of Spain's mighty empire in the New World. They still controlled those two countries at this time in history. Well, the people that lived in Cuba didn't like Spanish rule. So back in 1868, a violent revolution broke out in Cuba against the government of Spain, and it took Spain 10 years to crush that revolution. So there was fighting in Cuba between native Cubans and the Spanish government for 10 years, from 1868 to 1878. And it took Spain 10 years to crush the uprising. And how do you think those people in Cuba were treated after they were conquered? Horribly. I mean, they worked for starvation wages. Wealthy landowners that were Spanish were having these Cubans work for next to nothing, and they were treated horribly. Well, as a result of that treatment, what do the Cubans do in 1895? Well, they do. They revolt again. So angered by the way they were treated after the first revolution, in 1895, the Cubans again revolt. Well, the Spaniards respond to this second revolt very savagely. They put Cubans into concentration camps. They treat them horribly. Most of Cuba was in utter ruin. Starvation, disease plagued the land. The Spanish really taught them a lesson this second time around. So again, they revolt again in 1895. The Spaniards respond savagely. They put the Cubans into concentration camps. They treat them very poorly. Most of Cuba was reduced to utter ruin. Starvation and disease plagued the country. And who's sitting here thinking of themselves back in the American Revolution, watching all of this happen? The United States of America. And they're watching this and they just are not liking what they see. So as months pass, the Americans decide to join the Cuban cause, as they recall their own struggle for freedom during what? The American Revolution. Okay? Well, who will always push sentimental feelings in our country, even today? What group, what organization? What organization gives you information that causes you to feel one way or the other? You get on Facebook, you can see all kinds of stories, where the media. So what happens is 2 American newspapers, the most popular newspapers in the country, start writing sympathetic articles in support of the Cubans and how poorly they're being treated. And the 2 newspapers are the New York Journal and the New York World. 2 of the most popular newspapers in America start becoming sympathetic and start writing sympathetic articles about the situation in Cuba. And many people in the United States read these articles and they insist that America has the moral responsibility to try to restore order in Cuba. Free those people from these tyrant Spaniards. And pretty soon, William McKinley's inaugurated as President of the United States and it becomes his problem. Okay? And he is not wanting a war with Spain over this. So again, many people in the United States read these media newspapers, they figure out what's going on in Cuba, and they really start pushing President McKinley to do something in Cuba to help these people. Well, McKinley believes the only way you're going to do that is to go to war with Spain, and he really doesn't want to do that. Well, American newspapers start basically referring to McKinley as weak. Matter of fact, one newspaper said he was weak